They stole 3 feet of my property with their new fence. So I made their $800,000 house legally unbuildable. And before you think I'm the bad guy here, let me tell you exactly what these people put me through. Because by the end of the story, you're going to understand why sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to hit them where it really hurts. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. It was a Tuesday afternoon, around 4:30. I remember because I always get home around that time, and I have this little routine where I check my mailbox, wave to Mrs. Henderson across the street, and then head inside to change out of my work clothes. But that Tuesday, something was different. Very different. As I pulled into my driveway, I heard it. The sound of construction. Heavy machinery, men shouting, the rhythmic thud of post-hole diggers hitting the ground. Now, construction noise isn't unusual in our neighborhood. Someone's always renovating something, adding a deck, redoing their driveway. But this sound, it was coming from my side yard, my property. I got out of my car and walked around the side of my house, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There were at least 5 construction workers, professional crew with branded trucks, installing a brand new privacy fence. And here's the thing that made my blood run cold. They weren't installing it along the property line. They were installing it 3 feet into my yard. 3 feet of my land, just gone, swallowed up by this massive wooden barrier. And standing there, supervising the whole operation with his arms crossed and the smug expression on his face, was my neighbor Brad Morrison. You need to understand something about Brad. This guy, he's not just any neighbor. He's one of those people who thinks money can buy anything, including apparently other people's property. Brad moved in about 6 months before all this happened, and from day one, he made it clear he was different from the rest of us. His house, oh man, his house. It's this massive glass box monstrosity that looks like it was airlifted from downtown Manhattan and dropped into our quiet suburban neighborhood. All sharp angles, floor-to-ceiling windows, and this cold, modern aesthetic that screams, I have more money than taste. The thing probably cost him $800,000, maybe more, in a neighborhood where most homes go for half that. But it wasn't just the house. From the moment Brad moved in, he started this non-stop improvement spree that drove everyone on the block crazy. First, it was the landscaping. And I'm not talking about planting some flowers and laying down mulch. No, Brad hired this expensive landscape architecture firm to completely redesign his yard. They ripped out every tree, every bush, every blade of grass, and replaced it with this elaborate display of imported plants, decorative rocks that probably cost more than my car, and a water feature that required its own pump system. The maintenance crews showed up every single week, sometimes twice a week. Their trucks would block the street, their leaf blowers would start at 7 in the morning on Saturdays, and they'd spend hours meticulously trimming, pruning, and adjusting every plant to Brad's exact specifications. Mrs. Henderson told me she once saw Brad make them replant an entire flower bed because the colors weren't quite right. Then came the security cameras. Brad installed them on every corner of his house, high-definition cameras that could probably read a license plate from 100 yards away. He told everyone at the neighborhood association meeting that he was just concerned about property values and security. But we all knew the truth. Brad wanted to watch everything, to monitor everyone, to make sure his little kingdom was under constant surveillance. And now, here we were, the fence, the final insult. I stood there watching these workers dig post holes in what used to be my flower bed. The flower bed where I'd planted tulips with my late wife 3 years ago, and I felt this rage building inside me. But I'm not the type to just start screaming. I needed to understand what was happening. I walked over to where Brad was standing. He had his phone out, probably texting his contractor buddy or checking his stock portfolio, and he didn't even look up when I approached. Can you imagine that? Someone's literally stealing your land, and they can't even be bothered to acknowledge your presence. Excuse me, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Brad, what's going on here? Why are you building a fence on my property? He looked up slowly, like I was interrupting something important, and gave me this fake smile that didn't reach his eyes. Oh, hey neighbor, he said with this cheerful tone that made my skin crawl. Don't worry about the fence. My surveyor found discrepancies in the original property markers. Turns out this strip of land was always my property. We're just fixing an old mistake. just fixing an old mistake. Those words echoed in my head. I'd lived in this house for 15 years. My aunt owned it for 30 years before that. And now this guy who moved in 6 months ago was telling me that everyone had been wrong about the property line for half a century? That's impossible, I said, and I could hear my voice getting louder. I have the original deed. I know exactly where my property line is. You can't just move it because you feel like it. Brad sighed, like I was being unreasonable. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder. Inside were official-looking documents with stamps and signatures and all kinds of technical jargon. My surveyor is a licensed professional, Brad said. These documents prove that the original markers were incorrectly placed. Plus, he gestured vaguely toward the strip of land. My landscaping company has been maintaining this area for months now. That's adverse possession. Look it up. Adverse possession. This guy had the audacity to claim my land through adverse possession because his landscapers had occasionally trimmed some bushes. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just about 3 feet of property anymore. This was about Brad thinking he could use his money and his fancy lawyers to take whatever he wanted. I need to see those documents, I said, reaching for the folder. Brad pulled it back. You can get copies from the city, he said. I filed everything properly. If you think there's a problem, well, you're welcome to hire your own lawyer. But I'm telling you right now, you're going to waste your money. This is my land, and this fence is going up whether you like it or not. He turned his back on me and started talking to one of the construction workers. Just dismissed me like I was nothing. Like my property, my rights, my years of living here meant absolutely nothing compared to his money and his influence. What would you have done in that moment? Seriously, I want you to think about it. Someone's stealing your land, they have official-looking paperwork, they're telling you to lawyer up if you don't like it. Most people would feel helpless, right? That's exactly what Brad was counting on. He thought I'd either give up or get tangled up in a legal battle I couldn't afford. But here's what Brad didn't know. He didn't know who I was. More importantly, he didn't know whose house he was messing with. I went inside, my hands shaking with anger, and I called the city. I got transferred 3 times before finally reaching someone in the property records department. I explained the situation, told them about Brad's fence, his surveyor, his claims about adverse possession. The clerk sounded sympathetic but ultimately helpless. Sir, she said, if he's filed proper documentation with a licensed surveyor, there's not much we can do without a legal challenge. You'd need to hire your own surveyor, contest his findings, and probably go to court. Going to court. That's what Brad wanted. He wanted me to spend thousands of dollars on lawyers and surveyors and court fees, all while he continued building his fence and expanding his empire. And even if I won, it would take months, maybe years. The fence would be up. My flower bed would be destroyed. Brad would have gotten what he wanted. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about that smug expression on Brad's face. The way he dismissed me like I was nobody. I thought about my wife. How she'd loved that side yard. How we'd spent weekends out there planting flowers and talking about our future. And now Brad was paving over those memories with his illegal fence. But then, around 3 in the morning, something clicked in my brain. A memory. My aunt. My Aunt Eleanor had lived in this house before me, and she hadn't just been any homeowner. She'd been a city engineer. She'd worked for the municipal government for 35 years. Specializing in infrastructure and subdivision development. And our neighborhood, this entire subdivision, she'd been part of the team that designed it back in the 1980s. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. If anyone would have documents about this property, about the original plans and regulations, it would be Aunt Eleanor. And I knew exactly where those documents might be. The next morning, Saturday, I woke up early and went straight to my basement. Now, when Aunt Eleanor passed away and left me this house, I'd inherited everything in it. Most of her personal belongings I'd sorted through, but the basement, that was different. The basement was full of boxes and filing cabinets stuffed with her work documents. She'd been a bit of a pack rat, keeping copies of every project she'd ever worked on. I'd always meant to go through it all, but it seemed like such a daunting task that I just kept putting it off. Not anymore. I started pulling boxes off shelves, opening filing cabinets, searching through decades of municipal documents. There were blueprints, engineering reports, environmental assessments, drainage studies. It was overwhelming. But I kept going, because I knew there had to be something here, something that could help me. 3 hours in, covered in dust and surrounded by piles of paper, I found it. A large rolled-up blueprint tucked into a cardboard tube in the back of a filing cabinet. I pulled it out, carefully unrolled it on my workbench, and felt my heart start racing as I read the title. Master Drainage Map, Oakwood Hills Subdivision, 1983. Oakwood Hills. That's our neighborhood. And this wasn't just any map. This was the original drainage plan for the entire subdivision, showing every property line, every easement, every regulation that governed how our neighborhood was built. I studied that map for the next hour, and with every minute, my understanding of the situation changed completely. You see, Brad and his expensive surveyor, they'd made a critical mistake. They'd focused entirely on the property lines, on the surface-level boundaries between his lot and mine. But they'd completely missed what was underneath. Our neighborhood was built on a natural slope. Nothing too dramatic, but enough that water drainage was a serious concern. The original developers and city engineers, including my aunt, had to create a comprehensive drainage system to prevent flooding. And that system wasn't just pipes and gutters. It included mandatory easements, strips of land that had to remain clear for storm water runoff. And that 3-foot strip of land that Brad claimed? According to this map, it sat directly over the main storm runoff easement for our entire block. That land wasn't just my property. It was protected municipal drainage land that couldn't be built on under any circumstances. But wait, it got even better. As I studied the map more carefully, I noticed something else. The original development agreement, attached to the back of the blueprint, required all homes to maintain specific setback distances from these drainage channels. There were exact measurements, legal requirements that every homeowner had to follow. I grabbed a measuring tape and went outside. I measured Brad's house, his deck, his garage, everything. And what I found made me smile for the first time in days. Brad's house, with its oversized deck that wrapped around the back, its expanded 3-car garage, and now his new fence, violated multiple setback regulations. His $800,000 dream home wasn't just encroaching on my property. It was sitting on flood control land. Do you understand what this meant? Brad hadn't just made a mistake. He'd built an illegal structure. His entire expansion, all those improvements he'd been so proud of, they were in violation of municipal drainage law. And the penalties for that, well, they made a property line dispute look like nothing. I spent the rest of that Saturday gathering evidence. I took photos of the fence construction, showing exactly where it sat on the drainage easement. I measured his deck and garage, documenting how far they extended beyond the legal setback line. I found records showing that Brad had never applied for any permits for his expansions, which meant he'd done all this work illegally. Then I made copies of everything. The original drainage map, the development agreement, my photos, my measurements. I organized it all into a neat folder, because I wanted this to be absolutely clear when I presented it. Sunday morning, I started making calls. First, I contacted the city engineer's office. I explained that I had evidence of potential drainage easement violations and needed to speak with someone as soon as possible. They told me to come in first thing Monday morning. Next, I called the Flood Control District. This is a separate government agency that oversees all water management in our county, and they take violations very seriously. I told them I had documentation of illegal construction on protected drainage land. They scheduled an inspection for Monday afternoon. Finally, I contacted the Environmental Compliance Office, because Brad's construction wasn't just violating property regulations. It was potentially causing environmental damage by blocking natural water flow. They were very interested in seeing my evidence. That Sunday night, I barely slept again. But this time, it wasn't from anger or frustration. It was anticipation, because I knew that come Monday morning, Brad's world was about to come crashing down. Monday arrived, and I was at the city engineer's office when they opened at 8 a.m. I met with a senior engineer named Robert Chen, a guy who'd worked with my aunt back in the day. When I unrolled that drainage map on his desk, I watched his eyes go wide. "Is this," he started, then stopped and looked closer. This is the original Oakwood Hills master plan. Where did you get this? I explained about my aunt, about inheriting her documents. Then I showed him the photos of Brad's fence, his deck, his garage. I showed him my measurements proving they violated the setback requirements. Robert's expression went from surprise to angry. He started making notes, cross-referencing the map with current records. After about 20 minutes, he looked up at me. "This is serious," he said. "If what you're showing me is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt it, your neighbor has committed multiple violations of municipal code. Not just little mistakes. Major violations that could affect drainage for your entire neighborhood." "What happens now?" I asked. Robert picked up his phone. "Now," he said, "we send inspectors." Immediately, I left the city engineer's office feeling like I was floating. But I couldn't celebrate yet. There was still so much that could go wrong. What if Brad's lawyers found some loophole? What if the city decided it was too expensive or complicated to enforce the regulations? What if Brad just paid some fine and got to keep everything? But I didn't have to wait long to find out. By 10 a.m., I got a call from Robert. "Inspectors are on their way to your neighborhood," he said. "I'd suggest you be home to provide access to your property if needed." I raced back home, and when I arrived, I saw something beautiful. There were 3 city vehicles parked in front of Brad's house. Inspectors with clipboards and measuring tools were walking around his property, taking photos, examining his fence, his deck, his garage. And Brad was standing on his front lawn looking absolutely panicked. He saw me pull into my driveway, and he actually started walking toward me. But before he could say anything, one of the inspectors called him back. I watched as they showed him something on their clipboard, probably the same drainage map I'd provided. Brad's face went from confused to pale to bright red in about 30 seconds. Around noon, another vehicle arrived. This one was from the Drainage Authority, the Flood Control District. 2 more inspectors got out and immediately went to examine the fence construction. They brought out some kind of scanning equipment, probably ground-penetrating radar, to check the drainage channels underneath. I was standing in my front yard, pretending to check my mailbox but really just watching the show, when one of the flood control inspectors came over to me. "Excuse me, sir, are you the property owner who filed the complaint?" "That's me," I said. He nodded seriously. "I need you to know that what your neighbor has done here is potentially very dangerous. That fence is built directly over a major storm drain easement. If we get heavy rain, water that should be flowing through that channel could back up. It could flood multiple properties, including yours and his." "How long has the fence been there?" I asked. He checked his notes. "Looks like they just started construction last week. But his deck and garage, those have been there for months. And sir, we've already found evidence of minor flooding downhill from here. There are water damage marks on the property 2 houses down. We think his construction has already started to disrupt the drainage system." This was even better than I'd hoped. Brad hadn't just violated regulations. He'd actually caused damage. Real, measurable damage that affected other people. The inspectors stayed for hours. They measured everything, took dozens of photos, collected soil samples, examined the drainage channels. Brad kept trying to talk to them, probably offering explanations or excuses, but they were all business. Professional, thorough, and clearly not impressed with whatever story he was trying to tell. Around 3 p.m., I saw them all gather together for a conference. Brad was standing nearby, and I could see him getting more and more agitated as they talked. Finally, one of the inspectors, a woman who seemed to be in charge, turned to Brad and handed him several sheets of paper. Even from across the street, I could see Brad's hands shaking as he read them. Then he looked up, and his eyes met mine. For the first time since he'd moved in, Brad Morrison didn't look smug or confident or superior. He looked terrified. And you know what? I just smiled and went back inside my house. Over the next few days, the full scope of what was happening became clear. The city issued an immediate stop work order on the fence construction. The fence that was already up had to stay exactly where it was until the investigation was complete. Brad couldn't finish it, couldn't remove it, couldn't touch it. But that was just the beginning. The flood control district discovered that Brad's deck and garage expansion had significantly altered the natural water flow in our area. During their investigation, they found that the minor flooding 2 houses down had caused about $15,000 in damage to someone's basement, and that flooding was directly traceable to Brad's illegal construction blocking the drainage easement. The Environmental Compliance Office got involved too. They determined that by disrupting the natural water flow, Brad had also damaged some protected wetland vegetation at the bottom of our neighborhood slope. Not a huge ecological disaster, but enough to add environmental violations to his growing list of problems. Then came the hammer. About 2 weeks after my Monday morning visit to the city engineer, Brad received official notices from multiple government agencies. I know this because Mrs. Henderson, who's friendly with Brad's housekeeper, told me all about it. Apparently Brad had a complete meltdown when he read those notices, screaming on the phone with his lawyers and throwing things around his fancy glass house. The notices informed Brad that his deck, his garage expansion, and his fence were all in violation of municipal drainage law. But they didn't just tell him to stop. They ordered him to demolish everything. The deck had to come down. Part of the garage had to be removed. The fence had to be completely taken out. And all of it had to be done at his expense, under supervision of city inspectors, to ensure the drainage system was restored to its original condition. The estimated cost? $300,000. $300,000 to undo all the improvements he'd been so proud of. $300,000 because he'd been too arrogant to check whether his expansions were legal. $300,000 because he'd tried to steal 3 feet of my property. But wait, there's more. Brad called his insurance company, thinking surely they'd cover this. After all, he'd paid for premium property insurance. But insurance doesn't cover illegal construction. When the insurance company found out that Brad had done all this work without proper permits, without checking for easements, they denied his claim completely. Every penny of that $300,000 would have to come out of Brad's pocket. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Brad hired a team of lawyers to fight the city's orders. Big expensive lawyers from downtown, the kind that charge $500 an hour. They tried everything. They argued that the drainage easements were outdated and should be revised. They claimed that the minor flooding was caused by other factors. They even tried to argue that my aunt's old map wasn't valid because it was more than 40 years old. But here's the thing about municipal drainage law. It's not negotiable. It's not subject to interpretation or legal maneuvering. It exists to protect public safety, to prevent flooding, to maintain critical infrastructure. And when you violate it, especially when your violations cause actual damage, the law doesn't care how much money you have or how good your lawyers are. The courts sided with the city on every single point. The drainage easements were valid. The flooding was Brad's fault. The old map was perfectly legitimate because the drainage system had never been changed. Brad's lawyers burned through probably another $100,000 in fees, and they got nowhere. Meanwhile, Brad still had to live in his house, watching as construction crews he had to pay for demolished his deck, tore down his fence, and partially dismantled his garage. The noise, the mess, the daily reminder of his spectacular failure. I imagine it was torture for someone like Brad, someone so obsessed with perfection and control. Mrs. Henderson told me she saw him sitting in his car in the driveway one evening, just sitting there for over an hour, staring at nothing. The stress was destroying him. And honestly, I didn't feel bad. Not even a little bit. This was a man who'd tried to steal my property, who'd dismissed my concerns, who'd told me to hire a lawyer like it was some kind of joke. This was a man who thought his money made him better than everyone else, that rules didn't apply to him. Well, now he was learning that rules do apply. Even to rich investment bankers with $800,000 houses. The demolition and remediation took 3 months. 3 months of construction crews, inspectors, and constant monitoring. And when it was finally done, Brad's house looked completely different. The sprawling deck was gone, replaced with a small code-compliant patio. His 3-car garage was now a 2-car garage. And the fence, well, there was no fence at all anymore. But the story doesn't end there. Because while all this was happening, while Brad was dealing with the legal and financial nightmare he'd created, something else was going on. The property damage lawsuit from the neighbor whose basement had flooded. That family hired their own lawyer and sued Brad for the $15,000 in damages plus legal fees. And they won, easily. because the city's investigation had already proven Brad's construction caused the flooding. Then the Environmental Compliance Office hit Brad with fines for the wetland vegetation damage. Another $20,000. More lawyers, more legal fees, more stress. And here's the kicker. With all these legal problems, all these violations on record, Brad's homeowner's insurance company decided to drop him. Just completely canceled his policy. And when he tried to get insurance from other companies, they either refused to cover him or quoted him premiums that were triple what he'd been paying before. Because his house was now flagged as a high-risk property with a history of illegal construction and code violations. By this point, Brad had spent close to $500,000. The demolition and remediation, the legal fees, the damage lawsuit, the environmental fines, the increased insurance costs. $500,000 because he'd tried to steal 3 feet of my land. I saw him one day, about 4 months after this all started, when he was getting his mail. He looked like he'd aged 10 years. His expensive suits were gone, replaced with wrinkled khakis and a plain shirt. The arrogant confidence was gone too. He looked tired, defeated, broken. Part of me wanted to go over and say something, maybe gloat a little, remind him that this was all his fault, that if he'd just respected my property line, none of this would have happened. But I didn't. I just watched him shuffle back into his house, and I realized that sometimes the best revenge is just letting someone face the consequences of their own actions. A few weeks later, I saw a for sale sign go up in Brad's yard. He was selling, giving up on his dream house, his suburban kingdom, his perfect life. And given all the legal problems, all the violations on record, all the remediation that had been done, the house value had tanked. Remember, he'd paid $800,000 for that place just a year earlier. He'd probably put another $100,000 into the original improvements before everything went wrong. So he had about $900,000 invested in the property. The asking price? $650,000. He was going to take a massive loss, a $250,000 loss, just to get out. And even at that price, the house sat on the market for months. Because what buyer wants a property with that kind of history? What buyer wants to deal with all the documentation, all the past violations, all the increased insurance costs? The house became a pariah, a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when arrogance meets reality. Eventually, Brad dropped the price to $600,000. Then $580,000. He was desperate to sell, desperate to escape the disaster he'd created. And finally, about 8 months after this whole thing started, he found a buyer. Some investor who specialized in problem properties, someone willing to deal with the mess in exchange for a bargain price. The final sale price? $600,000. Brad Morrison, the arrogant investment banker who thought he could take whatever he wanted, who tried to steal my land because he felt like it, lost over $300,000 on the house sale alone. Combined with all his other costs, his total loss was probably close to $800,000. $800,000. The entire value of his house, gone, because he'd been too greedy and too arrogant to respect a simple property line. I heard through Mrs. Henderson that Brad moved into a downtown condo after the sale. A rental, not even a purchase, because his finances were so destroyed he couldn't afford to buy anything else. From a suburban mansion to a rental condo. That's quite a fall. And me? Well, after Brad moved out and while the house was still on the market, the city did something interesting. They sent their own surveyors out to officially resurvey all the properties on our block. And they installed new property markers, permanent concrete markers embedded deep in the ground, with official city seals on them. Markers that clearly showed where my property ended and the neighboring property began. Those 3 feet of land that Brad had tried to steal, they were officially, permanently, undeniably mine. The city even sent me a letter confirming the survey results and apologizing for any confusion Brad's fraudulent surveyor had caused. I've lived in this house for over 15 years now, 16 if you count the year of the Brad Morrison saga. And I've got to tell you, that side yard, those 3 feet of land, they mean more to me now than ever before. Not because of the land itself, but because of what it represents. It represents standing up to bullies. It represents the fact that money and arrogance don't always win. It represents justice, real justice, the kind where someone faces actual consequences for their actions. Last spring, I replanted that flower bed, the one Brad's construction crew had destroyed. I put in tulips again, the same kind my wife and I had planted years ago. And every time I look at those flowers, I smile, remembering the look on Brad's face when those inspectors showed up, remembering the moment he realized his little scheme had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. You know, people always ask me if I feel bad about what happened to Brad. They say things like, wasn't it a bit excessive, or couldn't you have just worked it out, or don't you think he learned his lesson? And my answer is always the same. Brad Morrison made his choices. He chose to hire a fraudulent surveyor. He chose to build illegal structures. He chose to steal my land. He chose to dismiss me and tell me to lawyer up. Every single consequence he faced was a direct result of his own decisions. I didn't make Brad violate drainage easement laws. I didn't make him build without permits. I didn't make him block storm water runoff. All I did was bring evidence of his violations to the appropriate authorities. Everything else, all the demolition, all the fines, all the legal fees, all the financial losses, that was just the natural consequence of breaking the law. So do I feel bad? No, not even a little bit. Brad Morrison tried to use his money and power to take what wasn't his. And he learned, the hard way, that some things can't be bought, and some rules can't be broken, no matter how rich you are. There's a new family living in Brad's old house now. They're nice people, quiet, respectful. The husband came over when they first moved in to introduce himself and make sure he knew exactly where the property line was. I showed him the concrete markers the city had installed, and we both laughed. He'd heard the story. Apparently the real estate agent had been required to disclose all the past violations and remediation. But you know what he told me? He said he actually got a great deal on the house because of Brad's mess. That problem property that no one wanted? It was perfect for him because he got an $800,000 house for $600,000. And since all the violations had been corrected, since all the illegal construction had been removed, he had nothing to worry about. So in a weird way, Brad's greed and arrogance ended up helping someone else. Some nice family got their dream home at a bargain price. The neighborhood got a good neighbor instead of an arrogant jerk. And I got to keep my property, plus the satisfaction of knowing that justice was served. Sometimes I wonder what Brad thinks about when he's sitting in his rental condo downtown. Does he regret what he did? Does he understand how easily he could have avoided all of this? If he'd just respected the property line, if he'd just been a decent neighbor, he'd still have his $800,000 house. He'd still have his deck and his garage and his perfect suburban life. But he didn't. He chose greed over respect. He chose arrogance over common sense. And he paid for it. Boy, did he pay for it. So that's my story. That's how I made my neighbor's $800,000 house legally unbuildable and cost him everything. Not through revenge, not through some elaborate scheme, but simply by standing up for my rights and bringing evidence of his illegal activities to light. And if there's a lesson in all this, it's simple. Your rights matter. Your property matters. And when someone tries to take what's yours, when someone thinks they're above the rules, sometimes the best response is to make sure those rules are enforced. Because at the end of the day, we don't live in a world where the richest person wins. We live in a world where the law applies to everyone equally. Brad Morrison learned that lesson the hard way. And honestly, I hope he never forgets it. 3 feet of land. That's all it took. 3 feet of land that Brad thought he could just take. And it cost him everything. If you ask me, that's not revenge. That's justice. And justice, real justice, is the sweetest victory of all.